You're standing on water, not on a beach, not on a riverbank, but on the flat gray surface of a shallow lagoon somewhere off the northern edge of Italy. There is no land here worth the name. Just mudflats, reeds, and salt marsh that disappear when the tide comes in. Around you, the water stretches for miles. It is too shallow to sail across, and too deep to walk through. No farmer would want it. No army would ever march for it. And yet, on this exact spot, this drowned, half-liquid nothing where the land can't decide whether it's land, more than 100 islands will one day carry palaces of marble, a basilica sheathed in gold, and one of the richest trading empires the world has ever known. So why here? Why would anyone build a city on water, the one place a city should be impossible? The land itself holds the answer. And like so many cities, the story begins with rivers. The Venetian lagoon sits where several rivers, the Po, the Piave, the Brenta, and the Sile, run down out of the Alps and finally meet the Adriatic Sea. For thousands of years, those rivers carried mud and sand downstream and dropped it here, where the current slows and dies. That sediment built up into a maze of low mud flats and shifting channels. Out at the sea's edge, the waves piled sand into long, thin barrier islands, the lidi, that stood like a natural wall between the open Adriatic and the calm water behind them. So the lagoon is a paradox. It is joined to the sea, yet sheltered from it. Sheltered enough that storms can't smash it apart, but open enough that boats can still slip in and out through a few narrow mouths. For most of history, nobody wanted this place. The people who mattered lived inland, in proud Roman cities on solid ground, in Acqua, in Altinum, in Padua. The lagoon was the poor, frayed edge of the map, home only to fishermen and salt gatherers who knew its hidden channels by heart. Then the world fell apart. In the 5th century, the Roman Empire in the west was collapsing. Wave after wave of invaders poured south across the Alps. In the year 452, Attila and his Huns swept through northern Italy and burned the great city of Aquileia to the ground. A little over a century later, in 568, the Lombards came, and they came to stay. And the people ran. They ran to the one place the horsemen and the armies could not follow, out onto the mudflats, into the lagoon, where there were no roads and no firm ground for a cavalry charge. The water that made this place useless was the very thing that now made it safe. Here is the strange logic at the heart of Venice. Its greatest weakness, that it isn't really land at all, became its greatest defense. An army that ruled the whole of Italy still could not cross a few miles of shallow, channel-laced water it did not understand. The refugees could. They knew which channels ran deep and which were a trap waiting to swallow a boat. So they stayed. They drove wooden poles down into the mud and built huts on top of them. A scattered, frightened community of exiles slowly hardened into something permanent. But how do you build a stone palace on mud that swallows your feet? The answer lies under the city, and almost no visitor ever sees it. The Venetians drove countless wooden piles, the trunks of alder, oak, and larch floated down from the forests of the mainland, deep through the soft mud, until they struck a firmer layer of packed clay below. Hammered in tight, side by side, these poles became a forest turned upside down beneath the waterline. On top of that submerged forest, they laid platforms of stone, and on the platforms they built. And here is the part that sounds impossible. The wood did not rot. Buried in the mud and sealed away from the air, the timber never met the oxygen that decay needs, so instead of crumbling it, slowly hardened, almost into stone. The whole improbable city floats on a forest that has stood underwater for over 1,000 years. At first, the Venetians had almost nothing. No fields to farm, no metal, no timber of their own, no land left to spread into. What they did have was salt, raked from the shallow pans of the lagoon, and fish, and boats, and a position. Everything else they needed, they had to trade for. So they became traders out of pure necessity, and their position turned out to be extraordinary. Venice sat at the very top of the Adriatic, the long sea corridor that funnels straight up into the heart of Europe. Goods coming from the east, from Constantinople, from Egypt, from the markets where the great routes out of Asia finally ended, could be carried by ship up the Adriatic to Venice, unloaded, and sent on over the Alpine passes into Germany and beyond. Venice became the hinge between east and west, the marketplace where the goods of two worlds changed hands. There is a word for a place like that, an entrepot, a city that buys only to sell again, that lives off the flow of other people's goods.
But how does a huddle of refugees on a mudflat become a superpower? It chose its master carefully, and then it outgrew him. For centuries, Venice was, in name, a distant subject of the Byzantine Empire ruled from Constantinople, and it used that link to win trading rights right across the east. By tradition, the Venetians elected their first doge, their own leader, around the year 697. The word doge comes from the same Latin root as duke, and the doge would rule a republic that called itself La Serenissima, the most serene republic, a state that would last for more than 1,000 years. In the year 828, Venetian merchants did something audacious. They stole the body of St. Mark the Evangelist out of Alexandria in Egypt, smuggling the relics past the guards. The story goes, hidden beneath layers of pork the inspectors would refuse to touch. They carried the saint home, declared him their patron, and raised a basilica over him. The winged lion of St. Mark became the emblem of Venice, and you can still find it carved on walls, banners, and gateways across the old Venetian world today. Then came the moment that made Venice unimaginably rich. In 1204, a crusading army turned up needing ships, and Venice owned the only fleet large enough to carry it. When the crusaders could not pay, the cunning and nearly blind old doge, Enrico Dandolo, redirected the entire crusade, not toward the Holy Land at all, but against Constantinople itself, the richest Christian city on earth. The Crusaders sacked it. Venice carried home a flood of treasure and seized harbors and islands across the eastern Mediterranean, stitching together a maritime empire of trading colonies. The 4 great bronze horses that still rear above the basilica's doorway were looted from Constantinople in that very raid. For the next few centuries, Venice ran the sea. Its galleys carried spices, silk, glass, and salt across the Mediterranean, and its merchant Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road all the way to China, coming home with stories that reshaped how Europe imagined the world. The lagoon filled in around its hidden spine, the great reversed S-channel you now call the Grand Canal, and at its center the Rialto became the beating financial heart of the Mediterranean, where merchants set the prices that moved goods from London to Cairo. Palaces of marble rose straight out of the water, their front doors opening onto canals instead of streets. The mudflat had become one of the wealthiest cities on the planet, but nothing built on a trade route lasts forever. When explorers found new sea roads, when ships finally learned to sail all the way around Africa to reach the east directly, the goods stopped flowing up the Adriatic, and Venice's grip on the world slowly bled away. In 1797, Napoleon arrived, and the 1,000-year Republic, the longest lived in all of European history, simply ended without a fight. And so Venice today is not a roaring megacity of millions. Fewer than 50,000 people now live in its historic center, and the number falls a little every year. But the water that built it has never gone anywhere. The same lagoon that once sheltered the refugees now rises up into the streets, the floods the Venetians call Acqua Alta, high water, that turned the great square of St. Mark into a mirror. To hold the sea back, the city has laid a line of giant hinged barriers across the mouths of the lagoon, a wall of steel called moats, that rises from the seabed whenever the tide threatens to come too high. It is the oldest Venetian story, told one more time. The water is both the maker and the enemy. It always was. You're standing on water, the same shallow, gray, useless lagoon where the land could never decide whether it was land. Beneath your feet, deep in the airless mud, a 1,000-year-old forest of wooden poles is still holding up the marble. And all around you, balanced on top of that drowned forest, stands the impossible city that the water both built and is still, quietly, patiently, trying to take back.